Hey, it's Laura with Low Marie Vintage, and today I'm going to be giving you some button hacks. So today's video is all about buttons. Low Marie Vintage is a vintage clothing store located in Raleigh, North Carolina. We also have an online shop, so people all over the country and all over the state can shop as well. When you're starting your own vintage clothing collection, sometimes you will have a problem with buttons, either missing buttons, hard to find buttons, or buttons that need a little bit of TLC. So the first hack I'm going to give you is the old switcheroo. So this is a trick I use when I buy a really beautiful item and it has lots of buttons, but it's missing a few here and there. The basic idea is to move around the buttons, so buttons that are less important, because there are less important buttons, we're going to replace, put those in the place where the more important buttons are, really the more visible button. For instance, this item, it's a beautiful 1950s era Western inspired dress, and it has these beautiful heart-shaped buttons, but it's missing a few in the front of the dress. Take some of these off the sleeve because they're not as noticeable and they're not as important, and put them on the front of the dress and replace those with a similar button, so a similar kind of silver patina on there, but make sure that all the buttons on the front of the dress match. Other instances where that switcheroo trick is going to be helpful is if you have maybe a long dress with buttons at the bottom that you can't see as well, or maybe would even be more comfortable if you left open, and just move those to the top of the dress or wherever you need those buttons. I've also done it before when I've had a dress with a belt where the matching belt covers the middle button anyway, so I can move that middle button that the belt covers somewhere else. So it's just the concept of moving buttons you can't really see or don't really need to other parts of your dress or shirt or whatever you're wearing. Hack number 2 is where to find buttons if the switcheroo trick isn't going to work for you. You might need a few more buttons, or just all the buttons are in terrible disrepair. So this is actually a trick I use all the time, but if I have a vintage piece of clothing and I need more buttons, I try to go to either thrift stores or vintage clothing shops and find similar buttons or similar amount of buttons on a different item, and it could be a crap item, you're just going there for the buttons. So just take off all the good buttons off the crappy item and put them on the good item that you have. Now this is after you purchase it. Please do not steal buttons. So that's a way, I mean, if you go to a thrift store and find a $3, not necessarily vintage, but just a secondhand dress with 12 buttons, you can put those nice 12 buttons on a really beautiful vintage item that's missing half of its buttons. So hack number 3 is actually replacing those buttons and figuring out where to place them on the item so everything works out, they line up with the buttonholes. Most of the time, especially vintage clothing that's been worn and is a little bit older, there will be either worn sections or fading around where the original buttons were. You can use that as a guide for your new buttons as to where to place them. And if you don't have any physical indications on the item itself as to where to place the buttons, you can make your own. Lay your item out flat, iron it if you need to, but make sure that your where the buttonholes are, that side of the garment is laying flat and is evenly spaced on top of where the buttons go. And you can use either a marker or even just a stitch and just kind of poke it through the middle of the buttonhole once everything's lined up. So just use that as your little guide, that either that marker pinpoint or that little stitch, just as your guide for where the button is. The size of the button is most likely going to cover it up. So hack number 4 is just more of a helpful tip. In the 1970s, that's when things started to be more mass produced, and a lot of the same button formats, button molds that they used from the 70s, 80s, 90s, those are still around today. So if you find an item from the 70s or later, if you go to a craft store like Joann's, which always has coupons, you will most likely, there's a good chance you'd be able to find those buttons in store, the same buttons that you saw on the garment. Hack number 5 today is for gaping buttons. So that's when you wear a blouse or a button-up and the boobies make the holes in the front of your shirt. Depending on the item, you may be able to sew those areas shut so it won't gape open. So I can show you on this shirt. So in between these buttons, I was having a problem with the holes coming open. But what I did is I just went in with a stitch, a blind stitch, and closed it up. So now I just slip it on and off because I really didn't need to button the buttons anyway, and it will never gape, it will never come open. I just think it works better than a safety pin. Last but not least is hack number 6, which has to do with washing your clothes. Now I have a whole separate video on how to wash vintage clothing the right way, so I'll link to that too. But whenever you wash something with buttons, you need to make sure you turn it inside out. I say this because anything with strings, or even if you have thread, it can get wrapped around those buttons and either pull on the fabric, which can damage it. Fabric is most susceptible to damage when it's wet, or it could rip your button completely off. So just always make sure you turn your clothing inside out when you wash it. And also, just a tip, just make sure your jeans are buttoned and zipped all the way too, so they don't damage anything else. Well, that's it for today. I hope you found those hacks helpful. Those are tricks and tips and tricks that I use all the time. If you would like to shop Lo Marie Vintage and see some of our wonderful vintage pieces, be sure to click the link in the description below. You can also find me on social media. I am at Lo Marie Vintage everywhere. Thank you so much for watching. It means a lot to me that you came by and clicked this video and watched it till the end today. Be sure to subscribe for more like this, and I hope y'all have a wonderful day.